agreed that having a round together would be an honor for him, as well as he'd heard about Charlie's stories and his accomplishments and truly admired his skills. And so Charlie said, "Would you like to play for money, Mr. Hogan?" Mr. Hogan says, "I can't play you for money. That wouldn't be right." He goes, "That would be unfair." "Oh, come on, Mr. Hogan, $1,000 per hole." He says, "I can't do that. What would people think of me? Taking advantage of you and your circumstance?" Replied the sighted golfer. And he goes, "Are you chicken, Mr. Hogan?" He says, "Okay, fine." And he blurted out, he just kind of blurted a frustrated, "But I'm going to play my game. I'm going to play my best. I'm just telling you." And then Boswell says, "Well, I wouldn't expect anything else." He says, "Well, you're on, Mr. Boswell. You just name the time and place." And a very self-assured Charlie Boswell responded, "Great, 10 o'clock tonight." When I was a teenager, there was an older man, an old gentleman by the name of Mr. Robillard, and he would invite us over to his house for dinner, him and his wife there, and she always drove the car, and I didn't realize it, but Mr. Robillard was legally blind. And so anyway, over at our house, and I was helping him out with something one day, and he asked me if I wanted to play horseshoes, and I said, "I don't know about that." But anyway, I wasn't very good at horseshoes. So he gave me a couple of white rags, and he asked me to tie them onto the posts on each end. And so I did that just to kind of humor him. And, well, you know, horseshoes, it's a gift, okay? I'll just tell you that right now. You need to be a little bit gifted at it. And I would throw my best horseshoe that I could there, and I'd get it near the sand, just outside the sand. Mr. Robillard would throw his, and all you could hear was clink, clink. And he would say to me, "That sounded like a ringer." And I'm like, he can't even see to the other end. He needed the white flag just to be able to just to notice that. And he knew his distance, and he had it down perfect. And it was a bit of a humiliation for me, I got to tell you. Well, in one sense, blindness is a matter of perspective, isn't it? Put a sighted person in an environment without light, and that person is now, in a manner of speaking, blind. People speak of being blinded by ambition or blinded by love, and we all know what it means to have a car pull out into our blind spot. Many years ago, I was in a church service like this, and the worship leader told us, "Let's just all close our eyes and sing, 'Open my eyes, Lord.'" I stood there and wondered where he was going with that. I guess he felt we needed a miracle that morning, no matter how small. In John chapter 9, Jesus healed a man who had been born blind. And he used this occasion to teach those around, the disciples and others, religious leaders, the problem of spiritual blindness and its terrible consequences. And I want to read from John chapter 9, beginning to read at verse 1. It says this: "As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. 'Rabbi,' his disciples asked him, 'why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins?' 'It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins,' Jesus answered. 'This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned us by the one who sent us. For the night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here in the world, I am the light of the world.' And then he spit on the ground. He made mud with his saliva, and he spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. And he told him, 'Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam.' Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing." The previous chapter in John, chapter 8, ended as Jesus was walking by those who wanted to stone him, saying that he was guilty of blasphemy. And John continues this story now, and with Jesus walking by a man who was blind from birth. And you get a sense of the flow of the text. And so that Jesus was not even shaken or disturbed about the scenario, the story that he had just come out of, by the almost deadly confrontation with the religious leaders. But we find him calm and acting with this profound disregard of his enemies and their hatred. And in the midst of all this attention on Jesus, he sees a man who was blind from birth. He sees the situation, and he sees that he's an outcast in society. And he's not too busy, not too distracted to take notice of this one who was most likely viewed as insignificant, perhaps even invisible to the society that he lived in. I want to share with us four things, some things that we can remember here today. Number one is this. In this story, we'll discover this, that Jesus sees even the least among us. He sees the least among us. He notices even the least, and this includes the blind man. Have you ever wondered what this moment was like for the man born blind? During the time of Christ, blind men and those people with physical infirmities were considered a burden on society, and most of them were abandoned by their families and end up begging for food and money on the streets. And they're looked down upon as the lowest class of society. They have no wealth, no power for other people to respect them. It's like they don't exist. And here he is that day, and Jesus approaches him. And he hears Jesus spit. He feels Jesus putting mud on his eyes. I wonder, had people spat on him or thrown mud at him in the past? The Jews believed he was born blind because of sin, so it makes sense that they may have despised him. What was it like for him, I wonder, when Jesus used spit and mud to invite him into this experience of healing? Not knowing where this was going, he probably was thinking about all the other times of humiliation that he's had to endure. And then Jesus tells him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. I wonder how far he had to walk. How many times did he trip and fall? It doesn't say that anyone helped him. Did he have to find his way on his own? Did someone come by his side? None of it made sense or even sounded necessary to me. Yet the blind man obeyed with blind faith, trusting that even spit and mud could heal him if Jesus said so. Imagine if the man had just shrugged his shoulders and mumbled something about Jesus being crazy and wiped his eyes off clean right there. But I'm glad he didn't. I'm glad he showed us what faith looks like. A blind walk or a jump or a stumble forward into the unlikely and maybe the ridiculous, just because some guy named Jesus said to. Here's the thing about faith. It only exists in the unknown and the unseen, in that space between promise and fulfillment. Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is the assurance that what we hope for will actually happen. I know it's easy to say, but it's sometimes hard to live. But when God invited us into the life of faith, he gave us the ability to trust him, didn't he? And believe even what we thought maybe were his craziest promises. But Hebrews 11:6 says this is how we please God, by believing that he is who he says he is, and he will do what he says he will do. And if we looked into the previous chapter of John, we read that Christ, he was fleeing from the mob who wanted to kill him. Yet Jesus still took the time to notice the blind man. And I love how the Bible makes it clear that no matter who we are or what our story is, God would still take notice. The Bible tells us that not even a sparrow falls down to the ground. And you may feel like the least person, you may even feel like the least of the least in this room today, this morning. But I want you to know something. God sees you and He hears you. Even like, no, God's too busy with so many other things. Remember that movie, that cartoon years ago, Horton Hears a Who? Remember that? You know, they are on, the people were living in Whoville, living on a dust speck, on top of a piece of clover, and only Horton could hear that. And they were yelling out, "We are here, we are here, we are here." Remember that? How many remember that? Dr. Seuss is a rock star. I'm telling you, that guy has, what a picture, what a picture. How small, insignificant, dust speck sometimes we feel. But God knows we're here. He knows we're here. He sees even the least of us. How many ever felt like the least of them at some time or another in your life? The second thing is this: Jesus came to do the works of God. That was why He came. He says it in the scriptures, and why did He do that? So the power of God could be seen in Him. Verse 4 said, "We must quickly carry out the task assigned us by the one who sent us." And then He spit on the ground. He made mud out of the saliva, and He spread the mud over the man's eyes. Have you ever heard the expression, "Here's mud in your eye"? You know, we have so many expressions, don't we? And I always wonder where they kind of come from. Where do they originate? It was popular in the 1800s with English fox hunting and racehorse crowd. Most likely it's a backhanded toast among jockeys, meaning, "Here's to you losing the race." If you've ever been to a racetrack after a good rain, you'd notice that the leading horse would throw up a lot of mud, and trailing jockeys tend to get splattered from head to toe. Christ became a mudslinging preacher in this story, says Matthew Henry. He could have cured him with a word. He could have just spoke the word. He could have just touched him, as He did others, but He chose to do it in a way that showed that He was not tied to any method, that He was absolutely supreme. God did so that the power of God could be seen in Him. He makes a blind man see by a method that one would think would make a seeing man blind. Dabbing clay on his eyes would close them up but never open them. But the power of God often works contrary to our thinking, doesn't it? And He makes men and women feel their own blindness before He gives them sight. John very simply says, "So the man went and washed and came back seeing." He just obeyed what Christ had asked him to do. That was faith. Jesus had a specific purpose for being there. He came to do the works of God, and this was just a precursor to what His ultimate mission was, to die on a cross for our sins, that we would be set free. The third thing is this: Jesus came to be light in our darkness. He came to be light in the darkness. He says, "The night is coming, then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world." And this man, when he comes back, trying to restore or to even medically restore sight to a person's eyes is nearly an impossible thing. I mean, they've got great technology today to remove cataracts and things like that. But this man had no issues from that point on. He was absolutely healed him. And when Jesus healed him, He didn't just heal his eyes. He also gave him the ability to see the world around him clearly. He changed the man, body, mind, soul, and spirit, so that the works of God would be revealed. You see, Jesus reveals that He is the light who has come into the world to remove darkness. And because Jesus has given us sight, we live fully in the sight and in the light revealed to us as we seek to make Jesus known to others so that their spiritual blindness might be removed as well. Verse 8 says, "His neighbors and others who knew Him as a blind beggar asked each other, Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? And some said he was. And others said, no, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am the same one. They asked, well, who healed you? What happened? And he told them, the man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. You know, there's nothing more powerful than a personal testimony. The neighbors of this man who now could see couldn't believe their eyes. They wondered if this man with sight was really the same man that they had known before, or if he was just someone who looked a lot like him. The encounter with Jesus had so drastically changed the man born blind that those around him couldn't help but notice. Isn't that the way God works in a person's life? When you have a genuine encounter and a relationship with Jesus Christ, you once were this person, but you're now going in another direction. Even your very appearance, your very countenance changes, and people notice. And the general witness of the Gospels is that those who had a supernatural encounter with Jesus usually left that encounter significantly changed. Following Jesus by faith will produce indelible changes in our lives that others should notice. The way we live, the way we speak, the way we interact with others will all be affected as we follow Christ. And as others wonder at the changes in our lives, we're able to share about the one who changed our lives. Well, where is he now, they asked. I don't know. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. And because it was on the Sabbath, you know already that in our series, Jesus had a tendency to really irritate those religious leaders. And he continued to do things on the Sabbath or things that would be breaking the laws. And the Pharisees asked the man all about it, so he told them, he put mud on my eyes, and when I washed it, I could see. And some of the Pharisees said, this man, Jesus, is not from God, for he's working on the Sabbath. Others said, but how can an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was this deep division of opinion among them. But then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? The man replied, I think he must be a prophet. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called his parents. They asked them, is this your son? Was he born blind? And if so, how can he now see? They're like, yeah, he was our son. This is our son. And they were kind of afraid of him, afraid of the religious leaders and thinking they're going to get punished. So they're saying, well, look, he's a full-grown man. You ask him how this all happened. And that's when they said for a second time, they called the man who had been blind to come over. And they told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And the man says, I don't know whether he is a sinner. The man replied, but I know this, I was blind, and now I see. I was blind, but now I see. How many remember when you first gave your heart to Christ, you surrendered your life to Christ? Let me see your hand. You remember those moments? You remember those days? Remember those days they were like, wow, those were genuine, those were real experiences. You couldn't necessarily articulate what had happened, but you could say, you knew within your knower that you're not the same person you used to be. When you walked in that room and when you left that room, something changed. Something changed. And so he's declaring this. But what did he do, they asked. How did he heal you? Look, the man explained, I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Oh, or do you want to become his disciples too? And then they got really mad at him for saying that. And then they said, look, we know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from. And the man who was healed, he said, why, that's very strange. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not God, he couldn't have done it. Well, this man was not versed well in theology, nor could he tell you much about Jesus, but what he did know was what Jesus had done and how that had changed him. And this is at the heart of what it means to witness to others about Jesus. Though answers are helpful to have, we ultimately don't need all of them. All we need is a testimony of how Jesus changed our lives. Can somebody say amen to that? He was a changed man. Body, mind, soul, spirit. He moved from darkness to light. Jesus came to be light in our darkness. How would you answer someone who asked you what Jesus has done for you? The fourth thing is this: Jesus came to confront spiritual blindness. Do you happen to know someone who is blind? Ladies, if you're pointing at your husband right now, you should stop that. You know, we go into a room, we're looking for something, we can't see it. It's kind of like, are you blind? Well, apparently, I looked. Karl Barth was a famous theologian, and he was on a streetcar one day in Basel, Switzerland, where he was lecturing. And a tourist to the city climbed on the streetcar and sat down next to Barth. And the two men started chatting with each other. Are you new to the city? Barth inquired. He said, yes, in fact, I am. Is there anything you'd particularly like to see while you're in the city? Asked Barth. He said, well, I'd love to meet the famous theologian, Karl Barth. And he goes, do you know him? And Barth replied, well, as a matter of fact, I do. I give him a shave every morning. And the tourist got off the streetcar, quite delighted. He went back to his hotel saying to himself, I met Karl Barth's barber today. It's easy to be blind to what's actually right in front of you, isn't it? The Pharisee says, you were born a total sinner. They answered, are you trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. And when Jesus heard what happened, he found the man. He asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said, and he's speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. And then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying we're blind? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But you remain guilty because you claim you can see. And Jesus started this chapter, remember, by saying, look, don't blame this guy or his parents for his blindness. They're not at fault. Now he's reiterating it. Blindness itself isn't wrong. It's not a sin. It's not error. But if you're blind and you go around telling people you can see, then you're wrong. And it's not just that you look like a fool. You close your eyes yourself off to help, and you're going to hurt others, especially if you insist that you can lead them. Thus the saying, the blind leading the blind. And when light comes to someone who doesn't want to see, it's a blinding light, not an illuminating light. And the Pharisees, here they are, they're forcing their eyes shut, not wanting to see the Son of Man who is speaking to them. You're not guilty because you're blind. You're guilty because you don't think you need to be healed. Some people feel that way about their lives. You see, spiritual blindness is a disease, and it's a disease that only Jesus can heal. And Jesus is the light of the world, and he has the power to remove darkness. In fact, he's the only one who can do that. He came to confront their spiritual blindness. He came to a man by the name of John Newton many years ago. In fact, it was July 24th, 1725. There was a son of a commander, there he was, a son of a commander on a merchant ship which sailed the Mediterranean. And at age 7, his mother died, and at age 11, he joined his father in the shipping business. Later on, joined the Navy, but he hated it. And at his own request, he was able to get employment on a slave ship, which took him to the coast of West Africa. And he was the servant of a slave trader, and ultimately became the captain of his own ship, one which plied the slave trade. A human trafficker is what John Newton was. One day on a particular voyage home, the ship was caught in a horrendous storm off the coast of Ireland and almost sank. And the man prayed to God. John Newton prayed to God. He said, "Have mercy on us." And the cargo miraculously shifted to fill a hole in the ship's hull, and the vessel drifted to safety. And a lot of people who said prayers like that, emergency prayers, 911 prayers in the midst of their situation and trauma. They've been blinded all their life to the things of God, but in those moments when they're confronting danger or death, things change. Well, later in his cabin, as he reflected on what he had said and what had happened, and began to believe that God had heard him in the midst of a storm and that his grace was at work. And it was marked as the moment that John Newton surrendered his life to Jesus. He started reading the Bible, and he began to realize his horrible crimes against humanity, just how awful that was. And he repented, and he changed his ways. And he looked back over his former life as a slave trader, and he was reflecting upon that. And as he was doing that one day, sitting at his desk, he began to pen these words: "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." He spent the rest of his life committed to ministry and social justice, speaking out against the slave trade. His preaching was so powerful and was heard by William Wilberforce in Parliament. And at one point, William Wilberforce was contemplating leaving politics for ministry, but Newton encouraged him to stay in Parliament, serve God where he was, and Wilberforce took his advice and spent the rest of his life working towards the abolition of slavery. Jesus confronted his spiritual blindness and offered him forgiveness and set him on a new path, and that's why he could pen those words. And he takes the time for us today. He takes the time for all of us, for the least of us. And he's here to do the work of God in your life. And he's come to be the light in our darkness. And he's come to remove our blinders. And as we sang earlier today, he's the same God. He's the same God as he's always been. And if he can do it in one person's life, he can do it in yours. He can do it in yours. But I love the words of John Newton. He summarized it so beautifully, didn't he? We all need to come to that place, I think, in our life where we recognize how amazing God's grace is. How amazing this man who healed the blind man, this man Jesus who healed the blind man that day and sent him to the pool of Siloam to wash away all that was keeping his blindness there. That's what Jesus did for us. He died on a cross for us. He shed his blood for us so that we could have the forgiveness of sins, so he could wash away everything that absolutely was stuck on our lives. He washed it away, and he gave us a new life. How many are grateful for that new life today? That new life in Christ? I suppose John Newton would have to think about his life over the years, and while he didn't really, he continued, he had this encounter with Jesus. He continued in his lifestyle for a while, but God transitioned him and made him a very powerful witness. And God can do that in our life. And as he wrote that song, I just thought, maybe we could just remind ourselves with those lyrics today and sing that together as we close.